Jason, welcome to NBF Roadmap.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you. So I think firstly we should probably explain the reason you're speaking here today, because not only are you a vocal critic, and I think most people, if they're on social media and certainly Twitter, they'll know you as a vocal critic of Facebook and Google. But you've also been directly involved in the actions being taken against Facebook and Google in the US. I think first to begin with, I think if you could just give a bit of background on yourself and how you came to be involved in the antitrust actions.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thank you for having me here today. In summary, I spent about 20 years in the digital media business personally, running large online businesses. The second half of my stint was with CBS Interactive, running their sports division. So I would run the business, and I've been on the other side, I guess, of how do you create a profitable and sustainable online media business in the new world. As part of that assignment, and over those years, I was heavily involved too on some of the associations and some of the policy areas that were developing, emerging back in the mid-aughts, like let's say 2007, 2008, when the programmatic world was taking off, and when platforms were really starting to get their acceleration. And so as part of that experience, I after 20 years on the operating side, I decided to jump to see in the nonprofit world if I could be of use. And particularly the gap that we saw was in policymaking, Washington and industry working together to really understand the underlying problems, where you kind of had to have a unique understanding both of the business and a very technical business, and also be able to explain it to folks that were new to the business.
Yeah.
And so as part of that, I joined DCN, which at the time was called the Online Publishers Association, and we relaunched as DCN in 2014. And so we're doing that for about 6 years now.
So one of the things we spoke about before was how it isn't always particularly obvious, whether it's to advertisers, agencies, publishers, it isn't always immediately obvious to them why there might be a problem. Many, I'm sure quite rightly in some cases, feel that the likes of Google or Facebook are, a valuable partner, whether it's in terms of transactions on their site when they're advertising with Facebook, or, sell side ad technology with Google. But what's the core problem here? What's the issue? Why should they be bothered at all about this problem?
Yeah, good question. From the publisher perspective, which is really who I represented, DCN is the only association that's exclusively focused on the content creators. And so what's unique about those companies is, and our members, which range from newspapers, magazines, television, to native digital companies, New York Times to NBC Universal, to Vox Media, to Condé Nast, to pick one from each category. All those companies have brands that have direct and trusted relationship with their users and advertisers. And as the digital world has grown up, it has become a world where, in many ways, it's a very good thing. A lot of incredible innovation and efficiency has been gathered by automating processes, making it simpler and easier to get to specific content, specific news and entertainment, making it simpler and easier for advertisers to buy ads and target specific users. So we've had this amazing unlocking of automation, both on the consumption and the sales side. But in doing so, we've also built up, and we've had a couple very, very powerful companies that control much of that automation. So from the advertiser through to the publisher, these massive intermediaries, and they're very good at one thing, and that's generating as much profit as possible for their shareholders. And that's been squeezed out of the interests of a lot of the other important parties.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's put some specifics. I think, even these cases in isolation can be quite overwhelming, but I think let's talk about Google and Facebook individually. I mean, what's the case against Facebook? Who's taking it? Who's making those moves? And yeah, what's the case against them?
Sure. The case against Facebook, I just started in the United States. There's certainly been some scrutiny that's been happening of significance in the UK, Australia, and Europe, elsewhere. But in the United States, The cases that were filed in December were filed by almost every state in the nation, state attorneys generals, and then separately by the FTC. And the cases they range from a series of harms on both, particularly the states, a series of consumer harm, advertiser harm. So, erosion of your privacy as a user, because Facebook didn't really have to care about your privacy. They got so big. On the advertiser side, there's a series of harms that are documented. Both the FTC and the states in particular, and this is where I think a lot of the press focus has been, there also is evidence of kind of a buy or bury strategy around their acquisitions that they made of both Instagram and WhatsApp, including access to data in which they were able to see that these were emerging threats. So therefore they acquired them, as the allegation, in order to contain that threat. And so, which is a clear antitrust law issue. And so that's at a high level, the cases against Facebook. I think important to also know, in a time like we're in now, nearly every state, so very, very bipartisan. And it also came after a multi-year investigation by our Congress, by the House of Representatives, led by Congressman Cicilline, which was also very bipartisan, where they documented much of the same evidence.
Yeah. And Google is obviously a very different beast in the way it functions in the market. I think it's probably more of an intermediary than Facebook. Yeah, what's the case against Google? And yeah.
Against Google, there's multiple cases. The first one that was filed in October is very focused on search and exclusion within search. So take Apple for an example. Google pays, it's well reported that Google pays north of $10 billion a year in order to be the default search for Safari. And so that type of conduct. In December, we saw the dam break, and there was then on top of that additional antitrust suits filed by nearly every state. Again, the Justice Department's also in on these lawsuits, and it includes much broader allegations around search, including some of what we saw in Europe, where there's vertical search preference. So Google, assisting shopping or assisting other products, YouTube. And then probably, I think, the most important case from a publisher perspective, and probably for advertisers too, there was a case filed in December focused on the entire ad stack, and where Google really dominates on the buy side, sell side, and the transactions and everything that ties that together. At a simple level, all these cases tie back to, no pun intended, but they tie back to Google's dominance in search. So how can we use the fact that we're north of 90% of the search globally in order to aid other business interests?
Yeah. To what extent do you think these actions have been deliberate? I mean, there are instances where you can, I don't know, I've seen, for example, Google be trying to solve one problem over here, and in solving that problem, they sort of create another problem over here for themselves. And sometimes that can be related to the simple scale of a company, that when you have different interests in so many different parts of the infrastructure across the ecosystem. To what extent do you think it's just a question from growing too big, and maybe, for example, Facebook genuinely wants to expand its messaging offering or its image sharing offering through those acquisitions? Or, to what extent is this a moral failure in the leadership of both the companies?
Yeah, I think that's where we'll have to see the lawsuits play out a bit. The interesting thing about having watched Google already be found guilty of some of these allegations in Europe and have significant bodies of work in Australia and UK is a lot of Google's arguments aren't new at this point. And certainly they will, not to make their arguments for them, but they'll point to network effects, they'll point to efficiencies, they'll point to data where they can show, as a beneficiary of the digital world, that the world is better because of what Google's been able to do to connect all these disparate parts. That the ad stack is more efficient because Google owns the entire ad stack in in a fairly material way. So that'll be the argument. Now, underneath that, what did they do in order to capture that much dominance and power? And that's where some of the evidence, then you get to, I think, some of the questions you're asking about, is there actual intent, moral failure? And I think in the advertising case against Google, there is actually a allegation that did get some of the press attention where Google actually, along with Facebook, the allegation is they colluded in order to shut down or hinder the advance of something called header bidding, which was, particularly concerning when you read the allegations, and a lot of it's redacted still, because at that time, if you can put yourself back in that period of time, Google had marketing reps and publisher reps that were sitting down with publishers saying, we love header bidding, it's going to be great for your business, we're going to make more money out of this. And at the same time, there's these allegations that they were separately on the corporate level colluding with Facebook to kill this off. And so, if that holds true and those allegations prove out, that's deeply concerning. And I would call that a moral, that's a Section 1 violation, and it actually could be criminal. So it should have everyone's attention.
And what do you think of the regulators' prospects for success? I think I can remember everyone getting quite excited when Mark Zuckerberg was being brought before Congress, and I think there was a lot of people asking the same questions that my dad might have. Quite straightforward, basic. How do you make money if you don't charge for your product? That level of questioning. Obviously, the Congress aren't the regulators and the people on these cases, but our industry is extremely opaque and difficult for outsiders to understand. To what extent do you think they're getting to grips with the nuances of the technology and the data usage and the impact that controlling buy and sell side technology, for example, has on a very complex industry?
Really good question. And I'd say two things. One, these lawsuits, the ones filed in the US, are scheduled and expected to hit the courtrooms in 2023. Although the state case against Google, we heard last week, they're trying to get it started in the beginning of 2022. So one, just court processes take time. Separate from that, regarding the preparation and capabilities, is an area I really do try to emphasize, because having been along for the ride on this one and watching it quite closely, we started in DCN's role started back in 2015, and frankly, that was just setting up the discussion of there's this duopoly and that most of the incremental growth in the industry is going to two companies. Nothing more than that. That was our entire goal, was just to simply educate people that didn't really understand digital, that 85, 90% of the growth in the business was going to two companies, and that's a problem. And so that's kind of very, very elementary, right? And we didn't even get to the part where we thought data and their unique ability to capture data across the web, across our devices, was the reason for their success. That took a few more years. But from that hearing where Mark Zuckerberg testified to U.S. Senate and Congress, the amount of education that's happened in that was spring of 2018. So in the last 3 years is incredible in my mind. And when you get down to like the subcommittee hearings, like in Antitrust last year, on both sides of the aisle, they really do understand the way the digital advertising business works. Now, it might not be specifically the people asking the questions, although some of the members of Congress do really understand it, but the committee staff and the folks that support them, they really do now understand the business. And then you get to the real regulators, like the AG offices and Justice Department, the FTC, and the questions they're asking, like I'll point out Texas, for instance, the questions that Texas is asking Google in their various what we call CIDs, the questions that I see in those are the ones that I would expect from some of the smartest people in programmatic in our business. And so now we're at a level of sophistications where I think regulators catch up quickly. There's new people, young people that are really sophisticated around these issues that are coming in and being hired. So I'm very, as bullish as you can be, knowing that they're still going up against some of the most powerful companies we've ever seen in our lifetime. So I'll stop there, I guess. Yeah.
And how long? I mean, you mentioned it's kicking off in 2023, but how long is it before we start to see meaningful action being taken? Do you have any? Have you been given any hints on the time frame for how long these things typically drag out for?
Well, it could, I don't think it's in anybody's interest, Google or Facebook, for it to drag out either, because it could drag out for years. And we saw that with Microsoft. But the other thing we saw with Microsoft, and the reason that it's in Google and Facebook's interest to move things along too, is that it really does freeze up the companies. And so, there's decent evidence that Google and Facebook exist and they had the opportunity they had because Microsoft was frozen and missed out on some different opportunities, from search to social networking to mobile. And that's happening. I think that's already happened for Google and Facebook. Like Google acquired Fitbit, God bless them. I don't know how that got through with the amount of data that Fitbit brings to Google, but I don't see anything like that happening again at this point for a while. And so, I was just reading an analyst report over the weekend that argued that Google should now proactively split itself up. That argument is there because they're not going to be able to acquire anything. They're sitting on $100+ billion in cash. They're spending $1 billion+ in legal fees, and each of these different emerging opportunities that they've got their hands in, whether it be cloud or health and med, there's different areas of their business. YouTube, that's not even emerging at this point, but shift to video is as hot as it can get. Are they better off just proactively splitting themselves up? So I think, the impact started the second those lawsuits were filed.
Interesting. I've seen any speculation on which parts should be chopped off, or which would be the most effective in terms of having a real impact. Is it about separating search from everything else, or is it about YouTube or the ad tech tools? Are you seeing any speculation on that front?
Speculation, it's what everybody wants to talk about, is how would you split them up, what would you divest? We've mostly avoided that because the counsel we've had, and we hear this from everybody involved, that you got to let these lawsuits play out of it and see what the real evidence is, see where the real harms are, have them proven. And so, but there's kind of three buckets of remedies, and everybody's got an angle on which one they think would be better. But there's real regulation, starting to treat them like what we call in the US, a utility regulation, or in Europe, there's some very interesting regulations moving with the new Digital Services Act, the DMA and DSA, that specifically target gatekeepers. And so, and in Australia, there's new legislation that's about to go through. And so there's that first bucket of behavioral regulation. There's a second bucket, which is real restrictions on their data collection, which GDPR is perfectly suited for, but hasn't really been enforced against them yet. And the US is catching up on data laws. And then the third bucket would be actually structurally breaking them up. And a lot of people lean towards that right now because they think, probably fairly, that, and I think GDPR is probably a little bit of evidence for this, is that if you're big enough, you can use your resources in order to avoid real behavioral remedies affecting you, right? So you can kind of lock in your growth and success through regulation. And so you must break them up, is kind of the argument. So those are kind of the three buckets, but we haven't picked a horse in the race yet.
And your focus is obviously mostly the US, but what do you make of some of the other developments taking place? We've had some moves in Europe as well and elsewhere. Yeah, what do you make of what's happening internationally? Do you feel like there's this international movement against them at the moment?
Yeah, it depends on where each of it's happening everywhere, and it just depends on where they are in the timeline. The UK, the antitrust investigation specifically of Google and Facebook was really, really strong. I'd encourage anybody to read through that report, including the appendices. but the regulation's a bit behind. In Australia is where the most focus is right now, and you can see that from Google and Facebook too, where they've threatened to exit the market even. And there's a new mandatory code, and now will become law, in which they have to do business with news publishers and give them money, but also give them access to proprietary data and changes to their algorithms, et cetera. So that one's really got Google and Facebook's attention, which I think is indicative of the strength of that work. It's built off of antitrust multi-year. No matter what they say, it was built off of multiple years of antitrust investigations too. So, and then Facebook's got a suit that's been through now. It's going in appeal in Germany that I think is particularly threatening to Facebook, which limits its ability to use data across its apps and across the web. That hasn't had as much attention, but I think also they likely are very concerned about. So I guess I'd highlight those. The last thing I think that I should mention, because we're talking so much about policy and regulation, and I know that can be heavy stuff, but the market in some ways is regulating itself. Google and Facebook aren't going to hold themselves back, but Apple right now is, we don't know exactly when, but they've said early part of this year, they're rolling out changes to the entire iOS platform around how data can be collected across apps and across the web. That absolutely has Facebook terrified. And I've seen estimates that it could hit their revenues by 10% plus. So in many ways, Apple, as the regulator of its own platform, is making moves too in parallel with the various governments.
Just a question of time before we have antitrust movements against Apple, I think. Jason, thanks so much for taking your time. I think this is, for me, one of the most exciting and interesting things happening in the industry. I think it's going to trundle on for the next few years. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.